It was never supposed to be found the boards above. It had warped, but not broken. The nails were rusted, but not loose. And yet, when the first layer of rot was stripped back in the late autumn of 2018, during what should have been a routine structural inspection beneath the pulpit of Salem's oldest standing meeting house, a place so old even the ghosts had forgotten how to haunt it, something ancient surfaced, something that should have remained buried, because the dead do not rest when they're ill. Names have been erased. The dead do not sleep when their deaths have been rewritten. And the dead do not forget when their blood was converted into land, deeds, and wealth, and quiet, generational control that still spreads across the veins of a city, like rot beneath whitewashed plaster and iron lanterns, because when the workers pulled up the floor, they did not find bones or relics or lost sermons. They found a book black leather cracked with time, wrapped in oilcloth, and sealed inside a hollow cavity carved by hand by someone who clearly feared what the book contained, and feared even more what might happen if it ever came to light, and yet light touched it, and nothing was the same after that. No announcements were made, no press release, no archival display, no exhibit, not even a name on the inventory log, just a private transfer to the Salem Historical Commission, then to a vault in Boston, where it was marked as sensitive material pending authentication, and then silence. But I saw it, and I read it, and I will never unknow what I read, because that book was not a church ledger. It was not a religious artifact. It was not a list of baptisms and marriages and pious eulogies spoken over children taken by fever. It was a record of names, over 200 names, none of them listed in any official history of the Massachusetts witch trials, and beside each name a date and a number and a phrase, some phrases short like acquisition complete, or matter concluded, some longer like refused questioning or transferred before dawn, and all of them signed at the bottom of each page by the same 3 names: Ezekiel Blackwell, Nathaniel Blackwell, Josiah Blackwell, 3 brothers, one a judge, one a reverend, one a sheriff, all bound by blood and ambition and a hunger that no communion could ever satisfy. And the names in that ledger were not just random victims, they were landowners, millers, merchants, widows, people whose property was uniquely positioned along rivers, trade paths, fertile fields, places. The Blackwell family would come to control, and still controls, because today, if you walk through Salem, if you pass the preservation districts and marvel at the perfect fences and the preserved facades, if you sip cider on cobblestones and breathe the staged nostalgia of witch museums and candlelit reenactments, you are standing on land that once belonged to the vanished and now belongs to their executioners, descendants who own over 40% of the historic district, who serve on every major board, who fund scholarships and sit at the heads of foundations, smiling politely while history sleeps with its eyes sewn shut. But the dead do not sleep, and the ledger is not silent. And there was one entry near the back of the book that no archivist will explain, because it is written in a different hand, with different ink, slanted and uneven, and not signed by any of the 3 brothers, but simply reads Mercy Blackwell, family matter resolved. And that was when I began to understand that this was not just conspiracy. It was not just secret murder or land theft or manipulation of the court. This was something else. This was ritual. This was blood law. This was the deliberate rewriting of reality by men who believed they had divine sanction to decide who should live, who should die, and who should be remembered. And that is why I'm telling you this, not because I want to, but because the burden must be passed. Because once you see the names, once you see how many names there are, how many souls were turned into ledger lines and equity portfolios, you begin to feel the sickness. You begin to feel the ledger growing heavier in your own hands. And that is when you understand this is not history. It is infection. So if you are still here, if you have not turned away or laughed or clicked elsewhere, then I must warn you, this is not a story. This is not entertainment. This is not a Halloween special. This is not a ghost story to be enjoyed. This is dangerous. Knowledge, this is the kind of knowledge that burrows into the base of your skull and keeps. You awake at night staring at the ceiling, wondering how many of the old houses in your neighborhood were built on bones, wondering how many names have been lost so that a few names could be gilded and revered, because we are about to go back to the beginning, back to the year 1692, but not the version you were taught, not the version with bewitched girls and spectral evidence and mass hysteria. No, we are going back to the real Salem, the one they do not put in textbooks, the one they do not dare teach in school, because if they did too, many questions would be asked, and too many names would have to be removed from the plaques. This channel is not for everyone. It is for the few, the damaged, the disillusioned, the ones who already know the stories they have been told do not hold the weight they should. It is for those who understand that truth is a blade, and once you touch it, you bleed. So before we go any further, I ask you again, what state are you in? Not just geographically, not just emotionally, but spiritually. Are you ready to see what was hidden beneath the sermons and the scaffolds? Are you ready to hear the truth behind the accusations? Are you ready to walk into the meeting house and look into the eyes of the judge, the reverend, the sheriff, and ask them what they saw when they looked at their neighbors and decided they were worth more dead than alive? Because the trees still remember, and the frost still rises from the same patches of soil where feet once dragged in chains, and the stone foundations of the old homes have absorbed every scream, every prayer, every confession torn from broken mouths in candlelit basements. And if you listen carefully, even now you can still hear it. The breathless quiet before the knock on the door, the rush of footsteps, the voice that says, "In the name of the court and the Lord and the true faith," and then silence. Again, because Salem was not a tragedy. Salem was a cleansing, and the water used was blood. And so we go back to February of 1692, to a town of 500 souls wrapped in cold and superstition, where the fields were dead and the woodpiles low, and the sickness had crept in under every door. And the Blackwell house stood tallest of all, with its rare glass windows and its black-clad patriarch, who sat in judgment like a second Moses, his brother's fire in the pulpit, scorching the air on Sundays, his other brothers walking stick-carving paths in the snow as he dragged new souls toward the jail. And inside that house, in a room lit by a single lantern, a girl named Mercy sat with ink on her fingers and silence in her throat, and wrote names into a book she did not understand yet. She had heard them speak at night, her father the judge, her uncle the reverend, her other uncle the sheriff. They spoke in code, but the meanings were clear. She heard them mention the Porter land, the riverside access the widow who had refused to sell, and she heard her uncle say, perhaps she will soon face troubles of a different nature, and she heard them laugh, and she did not know why it made her skin crawl, but it did. And 2 weeks later, the first accusation was made, and the Blackwells stood calm and solemn as the fires were stoked and the people trembled, and the machinery of judgment began to turn, not by chance, not by divine will, but by design. And this was how it began, not with demons, but with deeds, not with Satan, but with soil, and not with fear, but with hunger. And the ledger had its first new name in ink and a value beside it, and a note beneath it that said pending acquisition, and nothing was ever the same again. Do you feel that now, that pressure in your chest, that itch at the base of your neck, that cold hand reaching through the centuries? That is not imagination. That is memory. That is the scream of someone you never knew, but whose blood fed the roots of the story we were never supposed to tell, and we have only just begun, where the mask of righteousness slips further, and what remains is not confusion or hysteria, but something older, colder, calculated, and now undeniably real, because when you peel away the myth of Salem, when you strip the fabrication sown by centuries of apologetic historians and tour guides, you are left with a skeleton made not of folklore, but of ledgers, hammers, shackles, and fire, and at the center of that skeletal system sits the Blackwell, family whose names were never purged, whose deeds were never tried, whose wealth was never taken, but multiplied, because while others burned or vanished or were remembered only as shadows in the margins, the Blackwells rose in power like mold in damp wood, spreading silently the heart of a town already rotting. Salem in 1692 was no mystical place. It was a farming village, trapped between starving winters and failing crops. A place ruled by the rhythm of prayer bells and harvests, a town of 500 people too, afraid to speak, too proud to bend, too isolated to survive on kindness, and at the very center of it stood the Blackwell house, 2 stories high, with a front door imported from Boston, glass in the windows, and books on the shelves. Books most townsfolk could not even read, and yet what stood in that house was not just comfort, but command, because every decision, every law, every sermon, every punishment passed through that bloodline. And they wore their power like mourning clothes, black wool, crisp collars, tight cuffs, expressions carved in stone, and behind those eyes, behind those silent blessings and sharp judgments lay not the fear of witches, but the hunger for expansion. Judge Ezekiel Blackwell was 46 that year, and no one in Salem spoke his name without a certain tension in the throat, because his eyes were set too deep, and his mouth seemed made not for comfort, but for final words he sat at the head of the courtroom with a voice that never rose, because it never needed to. He simply spoke, and it was, so he claimed to follow Scripture, but his rulings always aligned with his acquisitions. His punishments always displaced someone standing in the way of his family's quiet empire. Reverend Nathaniel Blackwell was 2 years younger, thin, severe, with a face like winter frost, and a voice that moved from whisper to thunder without warning. He could make a congregation cry out in guilt before he even named the sin, and when he stared at you from the pulpit, you felt not seen, but measured as though he were taking account of your weight, your worth, your usefulness. And when he closed his eyes in prayer, his fingers never stopped moving, always scratching notes into his black bound book beside the altar. Sheriff Josiah Blackwell, the youngest of the 3, was not the thinker nor the speaker. He was the hand, the boot, the locked door. He carried a carved walking stick said to have belonged to his grandfather, but it was no cane. It was a weapon smooth at the grip, stained along the lower end, and he did not smile, not even when he drank, and he drank often, especially after midnight, when the arrests were made and the screams were louder than the wind. Together they formed a triangle of control: judge, reverend sheriff, no decision outside, their grasp no dissent left unanswered. And it is no coincidence that every property dispute, every trade disagreement, every inconvenient voice eventually found its way into the crosshairs of righteousness, disguised as justice. And what followed was always the same: a whisper, a sermon, a warrant, a trial, and then silence. The Blackwells controlled not only the church and the court, but the constables, the merchants, the supply lines to Boston and Newburyport. They determined who could marry, who could teach, who could buy or sell goods, and in the cold months of early 1692, with food scarce and tempers fraying their grip, only tightened because desperation does not weaken tyranny, it feeds it. And as people grew hungry and ill and bitter, the brothers watched, waited, and planned, because chaos breeds opportunity, and fear makes land cheap. What few dared say aloud was known by all those who stood against the Blackwells' lost land, or standing, or breath. Those who praised them found favor and flower and security, and those who stayed silent hoped to survive unnoticed. But hope is not a strategy, and silence is not immunity. And within the house, across from the meeting house, behind shutters closed tightly against the wind, sat Mercy Blackwell, the judge's daughter, raised in the home of her uncle, the reverend, educated, fluent, quiet, a girl of 16 with gray eyes that watched and lips that did not speak unless called upon, and hands that copied names into ledgers with precision and care, because she had been taught that God valued order, and that the church was the voice of heaven, and that her family were chosen instruments of divine justice. But she had also been taught Latin, and Latin has a way of making you see beyond sermons into the structure beneath, into the spine of the lie. Mercy was not rebellious. She was obedient. She attended services. She served at the table. She copied names. She washed linens. But obedience is not blindness, and observation is not silence. And when she walked the upper floors of the house at night, when she heard voices through closed doors, and phrases like her land will not hold, without a man or the Lord has revealed a new threat in the Westfield, she began to wonder if the devils her uncle preached about were not in the woods, but in the Awan. Study downstairs, and when she passed the locked cabinet where the smaller ledger was kept, and saw the key disappear into her father's pocket, each morning she did not ask. Why? Because questions were punished, even within the family. And yet she saw how her uncle's sermons shifted, how the verses he chose now spoke of hidden sin of enemies among them, of trials ordained by heaven, and how his eyes scanned the pews looking not for prayer, but for targets, and she saw how her father stared longer at the maps than at the scriptures, how his hand rested not on his Bible, but on the deed rolls, and how her uncle Josiah came home with red on his cuffs and new boots drying by the fire. The witch trials, as history records, were a fever, a madness, a communal delusion, born of fear, but that is a lie told to preserve the reputations of the powerful and to disguise the true nature of what occurred, because what happened in Salem was not hysteria. It was harvest not of wheat, but of wealth, and the Blackwells were the reapers, and the town their field. The accusations did not rise randomly. They were chosen, plotted, executed, each name whispered into being by a preacher's pause or a judge's glance, and the proof always followed conveniently. The witnesses always emerged reliably. The confessions always arrived eventually, under threat, under sleep deprivation, under pain, and the trials lasted less than an hour, and the verdicts were always the same. And Mercy watched it begin, not as a spark, but as a plan, and when the widow Porter was named as a threat to the church and taken in the night, Mercy remembered the conversation 2 weeks before, and when her land was signed over to her father for safekeeping. Mercy felt something in her break, because coincidence had died and strategy had taken its place. She did not yet know the depths she would uncover. She did not yet know the names. She would find the bodies that were never buried in consecrated ground or marked with stone. She did not yet know her own name would one day be the final entry in a book soaked with the souls of those her family had condemned. She only knew that the sermons had become weapons, the trials had become rituals, and the town had become a stage upon which the Blackwells performed a sanctified slaughter, and Salem would never be the same again. This is not a story, it is a descent, and what you find here is not a character arc, but a soul unraveling strand by strand in the cold hands of a truth, too heavy to carry, yet too dangerous to bury, because what Mercy Blackwell saw, what she heard, what she wrote, and what she never spoke, became the unacknowledged scripture of a town, built on execution, not exorcism, and no sermon, no statue. No plaque has ever dared to name what she became, or what she uncovered, or what it cost her. She was not the girl they feared. She was not wild. She did not faint in court. She did not see visions. She did not shriek about specters. She simply watched with gray eyes, the color of ash on a dead hearth, eyes that had learned early to notice without reacting, to observe without interrupting, to record without asking. And that is what made her more dangerous than any accused witch, because she understood the rhythm beneath the chaos. She saw the invisible ink between the verses her uncle read, and she heard the quiet shift in tone when her father discussed scripture versus statutes. And that is why she was given the task no one else was allowed to do. She kept the church records, the births, the deaths, the baptisms, the marriages, but not just in the official book. No, her father handed her another book, smaller, darker, bound in something smoother than leather, and stitched with thread that gleamed like silver in the candlelight, and he told her to copy certain names into it, names that did not appear in sermons or public ledgers or family Bibles, names that arrived in whispers after the doors were locked, names that belonged to people who disappeared, but whose property somehow remained. She never asked why the handwriting on those names sometimes matched her uncle's and sometimes her father's, and sometimes neither, and she never asked why next to each name there was a column marked with a symbol she did not recognize a sort of crooked cross with a circle beside it, and she never asked why her father checked the book every morning with a kind of attention he never gave her, and she certainly never asked why the book had no title, only a phrase etched on the inside. Cover in Latin, that translated roughly to the measure of men, lies in what remains after their breath. She only obeyed because obedience had kept her safe, but obedience also sharpens the mind in strange ways, because when you are quiet, when you are unnoticed, when you are trusted with dangerous details and dismissed in the same breath, you begin to learn things others cannot. And that was how Mercy began to understand that the line between sacred and profane was not drawn in blood, but in ink. And her family had been holding the quill. She remembered the night the widow porter was taken, the rain pouring sideways across the wooden slats of the meeting house, the sound of horses on wet stone, the sharp bark of Josiah's voice, and the long, drawn scream that followed, not high and terrified, but low and angry, the sound of a woman who knew what was happening and refused to let the storm swallow her outrage. Mercy stood at the top of the staircase, her bare feet freezing on the timber, her hands trembling with the tray of warm cloths her aunt had sent her to fetch, and she watched Josiah come through the door, soaked and fuming as walking, stick streaked with something darker than mud, and when her father asked if it was done, Josiah only nodded and spat into the fire, and said she fought like she thought she had a choice. The next morning, the Reverend's sermon was on rebellion as a form of pride, and the following week, the widow's land was quietly signed into temporary stewardship under Judge Blackwell for management until the trial concluded. But there was no trial, and within a fortnight, the fields had been divided, the animals slaughtered, the tools redistributed, and a new wall was being built that would connect the widow's eastern pasture to the Blackwell's own garden. And still, no one spoke. Mercy kept writing names into the small book, and each time her hand grew colder, her fingers more numb, and she began to wonder if the ink she used was dark from pigment or something older, something heavier, something that had to be hidden in oilcloth and locked behind brass because it stained more than parchment. At night she began to listen, not just to the voices, but to the silences between them. She listened to the way her uncle paused before naming a new sinner from the pulpit, and how her father's fingers twitched whenever the Reverend declared soul lost, and how Josiah would suddenly vanish into the woods before a new name appeared in the book. And always, always there would be a note beside the name, a short phrase, never more than 4 or 5 words, usually less things like no heir, no resistance, low valuation, simple burial, nothing that would seem strange unless you saw a dozen of them, unless you saw 30, unless you saw over 100 stacked like stones in a grave no one would admit existed. And Mercy began to wonder how many other ledgers there were, how many other rooms in the house had keys she had never seen, and how many bodies the land could hold be gone to reject them, before the trees refused to grow and the wells began to taste like iron and sorrow. One afternoon, when her uncle had gone to visit the Hales and her father was at court, she stood in front of the locked cabinet that held the book, and she placed her hand on the wood, and she whispered one of the Latin phrases she had memorized. From the Reverend's old texts, not a prayer, but something older, something meant to unseal, something meant to see, and the door swung open without resistance, and for a moment she thought perhaps the book had never been locked at all. Perhaps they had never expected her to look, because to them she was just a vessel, an obedient hand, a quiet shadow. She opened the book and turned to the pages she had written, and then beyond them And what she saw was worse than she had imagined, because the names were not just villagers. There were names from other towns, names she had never heard, and notes about relocations and assets transferred, and even names of children marked as collateral, and a final page with a list titled Pending Concerns, with notes like insufficient cause or awaiting consent. And she realized these were not just past victims. They were future ones, and some of the names had already been spoken in recent sermons, and one of them was a girl named Abigail, who had smiled at Josiah last Sunday and laughed when he dropped his walking stick, and another was a man who had refused to sell his timber rights to the Reverend's cousin. She closed the book and ran to her room and tore up a section of floorboard and stuffed her copied pages beneath it, and replaced the board and lay down on her bed with her eyes open until morning. And when the rooster crowed, she got up and went to the meeting house and copied more names into the public ledger, and smiled at the minister, and served tea to the elders, and said nothing. Because now she knew, and knowledge is a contagion, and once it enters you, it never leaves. And now the question was not whether she could escape it, but whether it would consume her, or whether she would find a way to become the shadow that hunts the men who thought they had swallowed the dark. Where history does not whisper, but gnashes its teeth in the silence, because what follows next is not chance, not hysteria, not divine retribution, but the deliberate ignition of a slow-burning fire designed not to purify, but to conceal, because the first whispers of witchcraft in Salem were not cries of fear, but carefully planted seeds sown into the brittle soil of a starving town by hands that already knew what they wanted to grow, and the harvest they reaped was not spiritual clarity, but acres of human ruin carved into parcels and signed in blood beneath the veil of righteousness. The winter of 1691 had been cruel, the kind of winter that strips bark from trees and marrow from bone, the kind of winter where the sky seems locked in iron and the wind claws through walls as if seeking breath to steal food was low illness was. Constant mothers wrapped their children in the same rags they used to bury the old, and fathers stared across frozen fields that offered nothing but the memory of wheat. The town was exhausted, bitter, fearful, and ready for anything that looked like purpose or punishment or providence, and that is why it began then, because the conditions were perfect, and the Blackwells were watching with the calm certainty of men who had seen such moments before and knew exactly how to guide them. It was Mercy who first heard the conversation late, one evening while carrying coals to the study, where her father and uncles sat with the door half open and the lanterns burning low. They did not notice her shadow along the hall, or the way she paused just outside the threshold, her fingers tightening around the coal bucket, when Ezekiel's voice rose clear and deliberate. The porter, widow's land abuts the river and the ferry trail. We need that access. Josiah grunted. She refused again. Last week said she's holding it for her son. Nathaniel's tone was quieter, but colder. Perhaps the Lord will test her resolve this season. I've heard troubling rumors of voices in her house, strange lights I believe her neighbors have noticed. And Ezekiel laughed low and steady. She will burn before the thaw. Mercy did not drop the bucket. She did not gasp or run. She turned silently and walked back to the hearth and fed the fire with trembling hands. And that night she wrote nothing in the ledger, though her father asked twice, and stared at her longer than he should have, and still said nothing. 2 weeks later, the whispers began, not about the widow herself at first, but about her servant girl, who had been seen speaking to the trees, who had drawn circles in the dirt, who had milked a goat that later died, and soon that rumor reached the meeting house, and the Reverend seized it like tinder, with sermons on the secret workings of evil, and how the devil moves through the weakest among us, and how the community must remain vigilant lest the rot spread. And on the third Sunday, he said the word witch aloud, and though he did not name the widow, the congregation knew, and their eyes shifted toward her empty pew. And the next morning Josiah came with a warrant and 3 men, and they kicked in her door and dragged her into the snow. And she spat at them, and cursed them, and screamed the names of every man who had tried to buy her land, and every woman who had stood silent, and her cries echoed through the village like thunder through frost, but no one came to help. Mercy watched from the top window of the Reverend's house, her fingers pressed to the glass as the widow was thrown into the cart, her hands bound in rope, her hair soaked in ice, and as they passed the meeting house, she looked up, and her eyes met Mercy's, and in that moment the girl felt something inside her split, not break, not shatter, but divide into 2 parts, one that still obeyed, and another that began to watch with purpose. And the next day, when her father told her to write the widow's name in the small ledger, she did, but in her mind she also wrote a second name, her father's, and beside it she marked a single word: predator. What followed was faster than she expected. The widow was not tried, not questioned, not held in public. She simply vanished. And when Mercy asked if she was to record the trial date, her father said there was no trial. The woman had confessed and been delivered, and when Mercy asked to whom, he only smiled and said to justice. And that week a new deed appeared on the judge's desk. By Friday, construction had begun on a new granary on the widow's riverfront land, and no one in the village spoke her name again. But the hunger had only begun, and now with the precedent set, the machinery turned faster and smoother. New names emerged, always linked to property disputes or debts or inconvenient loyalties. One had argued with Josiah over fairy tariffs, another had refused the Reverend's request to donate land for a chapel. A third had written a letter to Boston, questioning the judge's tax policies, and each was soon accused, each was arrested, each confessed, and none were seen again, and Mercy kept writing their names in the small book, and the notes beside them grew shorter, more efficient, eliminated easily. Strong resistance property, acquired confession extracted, and each time she copied them, she added her own marks, subtle slashes, invisible in the ink, but present a growing map of guilt. And still the town believed, because they needed to, because the fear was easier than the truth, because to admit that the devil was not in the woods, but in the courtroom, would mean that nothing was sacred, and no one was safe, and the sermons grew louder, and the punishments harsher, and the gallows taller, and the air thicker, and Mercy began to dream in Latin phrases she did not understand, and see faces she had never met, and when she woke, she could still feel the pressure of their hands on her shoulders, their breath in her ears, whispering their names over and over like a litany of vengeance. She began to notice things others missed: how the Reverend's eyes gleamed whenever he mentioned a new name, how Josiah's boots were always clean before an arrest, and always stained after, how her father stared not at the accused, but at their sons and daughters, as if calculating futures, and how every death came with a gain. Always land, always silence, always power, and she began to wonder if this was what damnation looked like. Not fire, not torment, but wealth without witness and legacy without judgment. And the darkness that had always pressed at the edges of her family's house now began to creep into her own skin, as she wondered how long before she too was a name in the book, not as a writer, but as a note, as a liability, as a girl who had seen too much and said too little for too long. And one night she sat by the hearth and stared at the flames and whispered to the ashes, "If I disappear, remember that I tried." The quiet horror that once crept now charges through the streets of Salem, unchecked, unrepentant, unstoppable, because what had begun as whispers, what had started as a single woman dragged into the snow, had now become a storm of accusation, a machinery of guilt, a blood-soaked procession of names, each one swallowed by the ground or the noose, or worse, while the Blackwell brothers stood not behind the curtain, but before it, arms raised, voices righteous, and eyes fixed not on salvation, but on possession. And Mercy Blackwell, whose hand had copied each name, whose eyes had memorized the pattern, whose silence had made her complicit, now found herself standing in the eye of a hurricane built by her own blood. By May of 1692, the town was no longer confused, no longer afraid, no longer hesitant. It had been transformed into something far more terrible. It had become efficient, the meeting house. Floor now bore grooves from the chairs dragged in for trials. The gallows stained and reinforced, no longer symbols of desperation, but of order, and the jail was so full that the cells bled into the hallways. Women slept in corners, men shared iron rings on the walls, and children wailed in their sleep for mothers who would never return. And through it all the Blackwells moved like wind through tall grass, bending everything before them, yet never seen as the source of destruction, only as its remedy. Judge Ezekiel now held court 6 days a week, his ruling shorter, more direct, more final, his gaze like stone, like scripture, like death. His hands never shook, and his pen never paused, and though he wore black for mourning, he smiled when verdicts were read and the gavel dropped, and each time a name was crossed from the list, the map of Salem changed a little. Another house sold, another field claimed, another storehouse reallocated, and all through legal means, through documents properly signed by trembling hands whose owners would vanish within the week. Reverend Nathaniel's sermons grew louder, more violent. He spoke of Satan as if they were brothers, spoke of fire as if it were his birthright, spoke of judgment as if he had already seen the end of the world and was simply preparing the town to join him. And when he preached, his eyes searched for those who did not tremble, for those who did not cry. And when he found them, he remembered their names, and within days they too would appear in the list of the accused. And when he stood at the funerals of those hanged, he declared them saved, not from hell, but from the sin of resistance, from the sin of rebellion against God's chosen. And the congregation wept not for the dead, but for their own survival. Sheriff Josiah no longer waited for nightfall, no longer knocked before entering. His boots struck the floor like iron mallets, and his voice was the law itself. He dragged men from their homes with no more explanation than a nod, and his walking stick, now carved with unfamiliar symbols, left splinters and bruises behind like signatures. And when the people saw him coming, they looked away, not because they feared death, but because they feared seeing themselves reflected in the eyes of the condemned and realizing they had done nothing. And in the middle of this chaos, this terror, this machine of moralized murder stood Mercy, with her ink-stained hands and her silent lips, and her ledger that now filled faster than her heart could endure. Each name she wrote made her colder. Each phrase she copied from her uncle's mouth onto parchment made her smaller, until she no longer recognized the shape of her own shadow. She dreamed of gallows of branches, snapping of ropes, creaking of screams buried in soil, and when she woke the eye, screams still rang in her ears. She began to notice something worse, something she had not seen before, something that terrified her in a way even the ledger could not, because now the names that appeared were not random, not merely those with property or enemies they followed. A pattern: those who questioned, those who doubted, those who failed to attend service, those who spoke out against the executions, even in whispers, those who stood still when others bowed. It was no longer about land. It was about obedience, about control, about creating a town that spoke with one voice, and that voice belonged to the Blackwells. One afternoon she watched as a boy no older than 10 was dragged into the meeting house, his eyes wide, his lips trembling, and when asked why he was accused, the reply came from another child, who said he had dreamed of the boy flying. And when the judge asked if the dream was real, the child nodded, and Ezekiel smiled and said dreams are often truth in disguise, and the boy was taken, and though he was never seen again, his parents' land was signed into probate, and Mercy added his name to the ledger, and beside it her hand shook as she wrote the words preemptive correction. She began sneaking into the jail under the guise of delivering bread and clean linens, she began whispering to the prisoners, asking them what had happened. Some sobbed, some screamed, some stared past her as if she were already a ghost, but a few told her of the questions, the beatings, the cold water, the sleep deprivation, the threats to their families, and always, always the promise that if they confessed, if they named others, they would be spared, and always the lie was followed by the rope. One man showed her his wrists raw and bleeding from iron, and said they asked me if I saw devils. And when I said no, they asked again and again, until I said yes, and when I asked who they were, the sheriff told me to name my cousin. And when I refused, he said my wife would be next, and now she is gone too, and I do not know if she lives or if she is ash. Mercy did not speak. She simply wrote his name in her other book, the one hidden beneath her floorboard, the one with her own symbols, her own markings, her own truth. She now kept two ledgers, the official and the forbidden one for the Blackwells and one for herself, and in her book she began to map the geography of evil, where the bodies were buried, where the documents were forged, where the sermons were written. She marked the houses that had changed hands, the barns that had burned, the wells that had been sealed, and she began to see something far worse than corruption, far worse than greed. She saw order, she saw strategy, she saw an empire being built, not on fear, but on compliance, on the ritual of punishment, on the cycle of confession and control and execution. And worst of all, she saw that it worked. The town did not rise. The people did not rebel. They prayed louder. They attended more services. They turned in their neighbors. They turned in their friends. They turned in their own children, and each time a name was read aloud from the pulpit, they nodded, because to disagree was to be next. And then the Blackwells knew this, and they fed on it, and they grew stronger with every death. Mercy began to change. She no longer trembled. She no longer cried. Her voice became still. Her gaze became empty, and she learned to smile. When spoken to, she learned to nod. When ordered, she learned to move without sound and to record without judgment. Because to survive, she had to vanish, even as she watched and recorded and remembered. And one night, as she sat by the fire, her fingers black with ink, she whispered to herself, "This is not a town, it is a sacrifice." It was raining that night, a thick, steady rain that soaked through wood and flesh and memory. A rain that felt like punishment, not cleansing, not renewal, just cold, relentless judgment, falling from a sky that had already turned its face away from. Salem, the meeting house, stood like a monument, to fear, its windows flickering with candlelight and shadows. The air was heavy with smoke and silence. But outside, beyond the square, at the far edge of town, the noise had already begun. The horses were restless, the dogs would not bark, and the trees leaned away from the road as if unwilling to witness what was coming, because it was that night when they came for Widow Porter, and it was not a lawful arrest, and it was not a trial, and it was not about witchcraft. It was about land and blood and the refusal to submit. She had refused them 3 times first, with a firm no, then with a petition to the court, then finally with silence. And for that silence she would be erased, not punished, not corrected, but removed like mold, scraped from bread, not because she was dangerous, but because she was inconvenient, and she owned the last strip of riverbank, the one the Blackwell brothers needed to complete their grip on the shipping routes and grain docks and the tide. And so Josiah Blackwell rode out into the rain with 3 men and a written order bearing Ezekiel's seal and Nathaniel's scripture, and they broke open her door with an axe, and they dragged her from her bed, and they gave her no chance to dress or pray or scream properly. They gagged her with a cloth that stank of blood and smoke, and they tied her wrists so tightly her fingers turned white, and Mercy Blackwell saw all of it from the upstairs window of the Reverend's house, where she had been copying scripture by candlelight. And when she pressed her face to the glass and looked down through the mist, she saw the shape of the widow in the mud, her hair hanging in soaked ropes her knees, dragging in the gravel, and her mouth still trying to speak through the rag clenched between her teeth. They did not take her to the jail. They did not even pretend to follow procedure. Instead, they took her to the black shed behind the courthouse, the one with no name, the one with no records, the one Mercy had never seen unlocked, and when the cart rolled back into the square empty save for the rainwater pooling in its corners, no one asked where the prisoner had gone. No one looked at Josiah's hands. No one asked why his boots were stained darker than usual. No one asked anything because by now the town had learned what happened to those who asked. Mercy tried to ask her father the next morning, her voice flat, her eyes dry, but when she said, "What of the widow?" he said, "The matter is resolved." And when she asked what crime had been proven, he said, "Sedition and deviation and willful resistance." And when she said, "What evidence?" he said, "God sees what man cannot." And when she asked what would become of her land, he said, "It would be managed for the benefit of the righteous." And when she did not respond, he said that silence too could be a virtue. And that day he handed her the ledger and told her to record one line, "Acquisition complete." And when she did so, her hand trembled so violently she had to stop and close the book and leave the room before he could see the truth rising in her eyes, like smoke from a fire that had not yet reached the floorboards. But it had started. 2 days later, Judge Ezekiel officially filed papers transferring management of the widow's riverside land to the magistrate's office, and 4 days later, Josiah began clearing brush with a team of hired men, not from Salem, but from Ipswich and Newbury strangers, who did not ask whose land they were carving, and who left at night with full pockets and empty eyes, and by the end of the week construction had begun on a new dock, a wide one with stone moorings and carved pylons that extended far into the river, farther than any other dock in town, and the villagers were told it was for trade and efficiency and the good of the colony. But Mercy knew what it really meant. It meant that the widow had been buried somewhere beneath that timber and tide, and it meant that the Blackwell brothers now controlled not just land but water, and not just crops but movement, and not just judgment but the means by which judgment would travel. The widow's name was never spoken again, not in church, not in court, not in market, not in whispers, not in dreams. Her house was dismantled, her well was filled, her fence was burned for firewood, and within a fortnight children were told never to speak of her, because forgetting had become safer than remembering. And the town obeyed, because the town was afraid, and the town was hungry, and the town needed the Blackwells to make the fear feel like order, and the silence feel like holiness. Mercy stopped sleeping. Each night she lay awake listening for hooves, listening for screams, listening for the sound of the floorboard outside her room creaking under her father's weight, or her uncle's shadow, or the wind carrying something longer living, and each morning she woke feeling colder, harder, quieter, and she began to wonder how long it would take before her name appeared in the ledger, not as scribe, but as subject, not written by her hand, but because of it. And she wondered if that line would also end with acquisition complete. She began to write her own ledger, not in the official book, not in ink, but scratched into scraps of parchment, hidden behind the fireplace stone, beneath the floorboard, in the lining of her cloak. Names, dates, patterns, she traced each arrest to each parcel, each hanging to each purchase, each accusation to each sermon, and she began to see it for what it was, not hysteria, not spiritual warfare, but a plan, a perfect, merciless design. And what chilled her most was how few had noticed, how many had nodded, how many had whispered amen while someone burned. That night, after the widow was taken, she went back to the Reverend's study, opened the locked drawer with the key she had copied, and took the ledger in her hands again. And when she flipped through the pages, the names stared back at her cold and dead and final, and beside each one was not a confession, but a property list, livestock, acreage, tools, children, and a final word resolved. That was the night Mercy Blackwell stopped being a witness and became something else, something no longer afraid, not because fear was gone, but because it had calcified into something sharper. And though she would continue to write the names, she would continue to nod, she would continue to smile when spoken to, but beneath her silence, the pages were being written, and they were written in her own hand, and in the end, when all had been wrought and buried, the ledger would still speak. Where truth no longer hides in shadows, but walks naked through the streets with a rope around its neck, and the sound of wood, groaning under weight, becomes the morning bell, and the names, once whispered in secret, now echo from pulpits and gallows. Alike in Salem is no longer a place, but a machine of sacrifice, a perfect engine that feeds on silence and obedience, and the first to be swallowed was Bridget Bishop, and Mercy saw it not in dream, not in rumor, but with her own eyes wide open from the edge of a crowd that pretended to pray while the sky held its breath and history snapped in two. June 10th, the year of our Lord 1692, the sun rose behind a veil of gray, as if ashamed to shine on what was about to happen. The crowd gathered early dressed in black, though no one would name it mourning, and the tree they chose stood on the hill, like a finger pointing to a god who no longer answered mercy, stood at the edge clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders, not from cold, but from the weight of knowing too much, and not yet knowing enough. The air smelled of wet bark and sweat, and something older than rot, and beside her, children whispered the Lord's Prayer with uneven voices, while their parents nodded with faces carved from stone. Bridget Bishop was led in chains, her hair loose, her face bruised, her dress torn not from resistance, but from the hands that had pulled her from the cell. And when she passed the crowd, some looked away, others spat a few, wept, and one man said aloud, "She bewitched my cow," and Mercy turned and saw. His eyes were dry, and his mouth was smiling, and she realized then that these people did not believe, they obeyed. They obeyed because belief was no longer necessary when punishment was predictable, and silence was rewarded, and questions were indistinguishable from guilt. Judge Ezekiel stood beneath the tree, his hands folded behind his back, his voice clear and slow and final. He spoke not of sin, but of consequence, not of proof, but of danger, not of truth, but of duty. And when he nodded, Josiah stepped forward with the rope in one hand, and his walking stick in the other, and the ground beneath them darkened not from rain, but from the shadow of the branch above. And when the rope was tied, and the knot adjusted, and the signal given, Mercy closed her eyes, but still saw it, because some images passed through flesh and inked themselves into the skull. The body jerked once, then twice, then went still, and a groan went through the crowd, not of grief, but of satisfaction. And the Reverend raised his arms and declared the devil rebuked, and the congregation said Amen, and the children were told to look and remember, and the list in Mercy's mind grew longer and heavier and louder, because now she knew death was not the end. It was a transaction, and the price had already been calculated in her uncle's ledger. That night Mercy waited until the house slept. The fire burned low, the wind whispered like a warning, and she moved barefoot down the stairs, her heartbeat louder than her breath tighter than her throat. She crossed to the Reverend's study and took the iron key from the hollow book on the second shelf, and opened the drawer that no one else touched, and pulled out the small, leather-bound volume, the one older than any other, the one whose pages felt like skin, the one that did not belong to the church, but to something older, something colder, something hungrier. She opened it and turned past the names. She already knew the names of men and women who had vanished without trial, whose land had changed hands quietly, whose children had been sent to live with relatives in other towns, whose homes had burned without witnesses. And then she found the page for Bridget Bishop, her name written in dark, careful script beneath it. Was not her confession, not her charges, not her last words, but a list of items. 2 acres adjacent to the east fence line, 1 storage barn, 2 milk cows, 1 loom, 6 silver spoons, 1 copper pot, and at the bottom 1 word, acquisition complete, and Mercy stared at that word, until her eyes blurred, because it was not judgment, it was not justice, it was paperwork. She flipped further and found pages marked with names. No one had spoken at all, not in church, not in court, not in whispers. The disappeared, the removed, the silenced, and each one had dates and inventories and signatures, and beside some of them there were notations written in a different hand, not her. Father's, not her uncle's phrases, like difficult, resisted. Partial confession secured, and worse, still eliminated. Quietly, and one line that made her throat close entirely swampside, confirmed. Disposal confirmed. She copied the pages as fast as her hand would move, her breath catching each time. The candle flickered, and her ears, straining for footsteps on the stairs. And when she finished, she returned the book, locked the drawer, replaced the key, and climbed the stairs with paper folded into her shift, and placed it beneath the floorboard under her bed, and lay there, with eyes wide open, listening to the creak of the house, and the slow beat of her heart, and the memory of the rope swinging in the wind. And she knew now what they were, and what she was, and what would come next. Because it was not a panic, it was a purge. It was not a crisis, it was a conquest. And the Blackwells were not afraid of witches. They were afraid of anyone who could not be bought, anyone who could not be bent, anyone who still believed land could not be stolen by prayer and rope. And Mercy Blackwell knew her name was not yet in the ledger, but someday it would be, and when it was she would not go quietly. Then let it end the way all buried truths do, not with closure, not with justice, not with the warm breath of redemption, but with the cold weight of realization pressing down on the ribs, like a stone slab on a sealed coffin, because this was never meant to be a story that resolved. It was meant to infect disdain, to wake the part of your mind that always knew. Something darker breathed beneath the painted surface of history, and now it stares back from the mirror, and it will never look away. It ended not with fire, not with a trial, not even with a scream, but with ink, one final line in the ledger, one final name, and 5 words. Mercy Blackwell family. Matter resolved, because it had become obvious to the brothers that she knew too much. Her questions had become too precise, her silence too controlled, her eyes too clear, and when the Reverend caught her replacing the book one night, just after the 4th hanging in August, he said nothing. He simply looked at her for a long time, then nodded slowly and closed the drawer behind her, and she knew then that her time was counted in hours, not days. They did not accuse her of witchcraft. They did not beat her. They did not even speak ill of her in public. They simply said she had taken ill, that she had left to visit cousins in Rhode Island, that she had grown overwhelmed by the horrors of the trials and needed rest. And that was what people wanted to hear, because Salem was tired of blood, tired of truth, tired of the eyes of the dead, watching them from every tree and attic and prayer book. And so they let her disappear, and the house she had lived in became the office of the new magistrate, and her room was turned into storage, and the loose floorboard was nailed shut with a single iron spike. Years passed, then decades, then centuries. The trials were written into history as a dark but closed chapter. A warning, a footnote, a moral tale, and the names remembered were those sanctioned by the state. 19 executions, 20, if you count Giles. Corey crushed by stones, and that was the count the textbooks accepted, and the townspeople passed on to their children, and the church restored, and the grave markers placed, and the museums opened, and the ghosts commodified, but the ledger was never found, not until 2018, when beneath the rotting floorboards of the meeting house, a contractor with no knowledge of what he held lifted a book from the earth and opened it to a page where Mercy's name stared back. Family matter resolved. And beside it, a second smaller line written in the margin in a hand, not her father's, not her uncle's, but her own, written in faded ink beneath the date, October 1720. This story is not finished. Because it wasn't, because it isn't, because as long as the land remains in their name, as long as the descendants of Judge Ezekiel Blackwell own 40% of Salem's historic district, as long as the dock still bears Josiah's carvings beneath its new planks, and as long as the sermons still echo with the cadence of Reverend Nathaniel, then the ledger is still open, and the truth is still waiting, and the ghosts are not haunting, they are remembering, and you, who have heard this story, you are now part of it, not a listener but a witness, not a spectator but a bearer of knowledge that cannot be forgotten and must never be spoken aloud in certain places. So what will you do now? Will you go back to the tour guides and the postcards and the souvenir witch hats? Or will you remember that the rope never stopped swinging, it only grew quieter, that the fire never went out, it only burned beneath the surface, and that every silence you accept might be the next line in a ledger still being written? The Blackwell ledger is not history. It is a prophecy, and your name is not there. Yet,